Well, I just want to welcome everyone this morning to Issaquah's community convening on climate. We're really excited to be here today to bring together residents, businesses, nonprofits, students, educational institutions, and environmental professionals to discuss climate change. We'd originally had this scheduled as an in-person convening for early May, so I'm glad that we're able to get together in these more difficult times virtually. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Megan Curtis Murphy, a sustainability coordinator with the city. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can start the presentation this morning. Okay. So before we get into the convening, I want to address a few housekeeping items with the WebEx platform this morning that we're using today. Gus checked several people with their audio this morning, so thank you for that. I appreciate your help with that. So the control buttons that you see on the screen can be found in the bottom middle of your screen. Please note that if the mute button is red, you are muted. If it's black, you are not muted. We are asking the participants use the chat only to indicate that you have a question or a comment. We will then call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask the question. If you've joined us by phone, you'll not be able to unmute yourself. If you are also on the computer, you can indicate that you are a phone caller in your chat message and include your phone number so we can unmute you later at that time. If you're joining by phone and not the computer, you can press *3 to raise your hand and we can call on you that way. Then press *3 again to lower your hand. And if you're not on the phone, then you do not need to raise your hand. You can just type in the chat for a question. And finally, we're recording this meeting and we'll provide the recording following the presentation. The City of Issaquah has been working closely with several local organizations to bring this event to you today. The organizations include People for Climate Action, Issaquah Alps Trails Club, the Greater Issaquah Chamber of Commerce, and Friends of the Issaquah Salmon Hatchery. You'll be hearing from representatives from a couple of these organizations today, talking about why it's important for these groups to address climate change and inspiring us to work together to find solutions. Along with the community sponsors, we have a lot of partners who are joining us today. I'll name several here, then there's more as well. We have King County, Puget Sound Energy, King Conservation District, Cascade Water Alliance, Recology, City Forest Credits, Issaquah School District, representative from the Snoqualmie Tribe, Climate Solutions, Cedar Grove, several students, Built Green, and also several other community partners. So thank you everyone for taking the time this morning to spend with us. So as you know, this is day one of the two-part webinar series. The purpose of the series is for the community to get together and help identify recommendations to the City of Issaquah and community leaders for a course of action to address climate change. Community leaders may be from businesses, nonprofits, as well as residents and agents of change. Today, we are hoping to create a common foundation of knowledge about local conditions and climate change in Issaquah. In part 2, on July 30th, we'll be engaging in discussion via breakout groups on a course of action to address climate. Shortly, we'll be hearing from Mayor Pauley about the importance of this work and some of the challenges we're facing as well. Next, David Dunphy of Issaquah Alps Trails Club will review the meeting goals for this two-part series and tell us why this organization believes it's important to address climate change. And then I will talk about the city's recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory, what we have been up to locally, as well as state and regional policies and collaborations. Then we'll hear from Drew Wilkinson, the lead and co-founder of Microsoft's worldwide sustainability community. He will share with us about Microsoft's goals and how even just a few folks at a big company can make a difference. And he works out of the Microsoft office here in Issaquah. Next, we'll hear from Ann Fletcher, who leads the local Issaquah chapter of People for Climate Action, a group that has been instrumental in getting us to this convening today and collaborating with the city on climate. Last, we'll do a quick poll to get us prepared for part 2. In part 2, we'll have an opportunity to have more in-depth discussions in breakout groups. The topic of the first breakout group will be working on an approach to address climate change, and the second will be more topic specific. As you listen to the presentation today, you can think about which breakout group you might want to join. The options are energy and green building, transportation and land use, waste and consumption, and sequestration and resiliency. After the convening is over, the city and sponsoring organizations will work together to share their ideas in a list of recommendations to be presented to the city and community leaders. And I know Mayor Pauley is looking forward to hearing what the community has to say. So with that, I will turn it over to her.
Megan, just had to make sure I was unmuted.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It is great to see you, even if it's only in our video format. I've had the great pleasure of working with Megan very closely for the last 2 to 3 years during my attendance at the King County Climate Collaboration, and she is just doing a great job, even in these strange times of pulling everything together for us. So I wanted to thank her right up front. As mayor, I'm prioritizing our work on climate in our city and have been engaged with other elected officials on climate actions through the important work of the King County City's Climate Collaboration. I was fortunate enough to begin serving on that as a council member, so probably have had 4 years or so working with that group. We're going to hear a lot about the work the city has done later in the presentation today, so I'd like to share some personal stories about how the challenges we are facing today can help us in the future address climate change. So in my personal life, I chose to relocate and move to my second home in Issaquah near transit. That allowed my husband and I to be able to bike and walk to the majority of things we do, even grocery shopping, and even to get rid of one of our cars, which has been, we didn't think it was possible, but it's been really fun. In the new house that we built, my husband's very interested in green buildings, very familiar with Leah Missick, who's on this call today, and wanted to build something that was really climate conscious, energy sensitive, and used a lot of the ideas that are out there with new technologies. We also got to participate in the City Solarize campaign about a year after we were built, and we purchased our own array for our house in Old Town. So I spent a lot of time thinking about green building, a lot of time thinking about how we can conserve energy, how we can reduce waste. And these are important steps that we can take and that we can turn into a community-wide effort. So now more than ever, I've seen the strength and courage that this community is capable of, and I know we can work together to become a more resilient people and city in the face of these extraordinary challenges. And as a country, a city, and as individuals, we are facing unprecedented times. COVID-19 made us change the way we live and work overnight. And meanwhile, following the senseless death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, people across the country, including on the steps of Issaquah City Hall, have rightfully demonstrated against racial injustice throughout the country. The Black Lives Matter demonstrators have asked that we take this moment to talk about what we need to do as people, as residents, and as community members to recognize racial bias and make changes to eliminate the disproportionate damage it is doing to people of color. I have heard heartfelt and rightfully angry stories, oopsie, got someone talking in the background, from community members about their experiences with racism in our own backyard. And I will work tirelessly with our community to find a meaningful and effective path forward. Many of the strengths and actions the city has taken and I have witnessed in our community are necessary in fighting climate change as well. Community members have stepped up to speak out against some of our country's most harmful and systemic failures. We as a city and a community have taken bold steps in responding to unprecedented challenges. We went from commuting to work every day to teleworking and virtual meetings literally overnight. We have listened to the science that tells us to wear masks and stay home to prevent the spread of the virus. We have prioritized efficient and equitable use of funds by providing financial assistance to where it is needed most, especially to low-income individuals and families. And we have shown leadership as a city in helping to solve complex problems. All of these things are important and necessary in the fight against climate change as well. Global daily emissions have dropped by up to 17%, but even though we have seen a reduction in emissions, this does not equal progress on climate change. It will take the hard work of all of us together to make real progress on our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And today is an important step in that process. I'm excited to hear what you've all come up with and review it to see how we can work together to make change. So thank you all for being here today, and I'm going to turn it back over to our host, Megan. Thanks, Megan.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Pauly, and thank you for joining us today and wishing us well in our next 2 days of hard work that we're going to be doing here. So with that, I would like to pass it to David Dunphy to talk about our meeting goals for today. David.
So our meetings have 4 kind of broad goals. So the first is to bring together a broad cross-section of the community and stakeholders for thoughtful discussion and feedback about local climate action. The second is to provide a common foundation and knowledge of the awareness of the data we have in Issaquah and what we've done in the past and are currently working on. The third is to identify recommendations to city and community leaders of a course of action that we can do to address climate change in Issaquah. And the fourth is to provide the opportunity to build and strengthen relationships for this common action. And the Issaquah Alps Trails Club is really excited that the city, nonprofits, business, and residents are willing to take on this, and that we really see ourselves becoming a leader in climate action in our area. It's exciting that the Trails Club has been working a long time thinking about how to preserve the public lands around Issaquah and broaden those. And we see this climate action as a way to re-envision the value of some of those public lands and seeing the value of them as their ecosystem services, such as a carbon sink and much more. But to echo what the mayor was saying, these issues are kind of convergence, that when we work together to think of new ways to address climate change, we're actually doing justice. We're doing how we live together on this planet. So we're excited to support that effort. And I'll hand it back over to you, Megan, to hear more about that data and what Issaquah's been up to.
Great. Thank you. Yes, it's been really great having all of the partners with us here today and getting involved in both the planning for the important event today and then all the hard work we'll be doing after as well. So again, thank you for that. As David mentioned, one of our meeting goals for today is to provide for a common foundation of knowledge and awareness of climate data in Issaquah, as well as learn about the types of things the city has done to address climate change and other state and regional actions and legislation. So I'm going to try to provide that foundation today to help inform our discussions on July 30th. We'll also be providing a copy of the presentation with the video recording after this meeting as well, if you want to do further review. In 2014, the city adopted greenhouse gas targets to reduce emissions 25% by 2050 and by 2030, 50% by 2030 and 50% by 2050 with a base year of 2007. So we're going to be talking about those goals, and then I will also give an overview of our carbon inventory. I'll pause for a few minutes after this section for any questions on the inventory. So again, if you have a question, please type the word question in the chat box and we'll unmute you at that time. So after that, we'll then talk about past and current climate efforts in the city and how that relates to state and regional legislation and collaborations. And lastly, we'll talk about the impacts of climate and why work on our climate resilience and preparedness is so important. So reviewing our climate targets, these were adopted in 2014 by the city and are included in our comprehensive plan as well. The inventory is important because it calculates our approximate emissions to track progress towards these climate goals. We can then use this data to help inform policies and programs and planning. The information lets us know what the highest sources of emissions are, and the trends help us target our planning and actions to reduce emissions. Lastly, as a leader in sustainability, we want to indicate our community's contribution to climate change and be active in reducing those emissions and accountable to our community. The city conducts a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory once every 5 years. This most recent inventory is from 2017 and is the city's third update. The city uses a geographic-based inventory, which accounts for emissions within our city's boundary, but also includes the emissions from sources like electricity that take place outside our city but are consumed by residents and businesses in the city. Here is a quick snapshot to show the breakdown of emissions. Overall, 38% of our emissions come from transportation, while the remaining 62% are from buildings. The residential and commercial sectors make up about 30% each, and industrial is the smallest sector at 3%. The GHG emissions in this inventory come from 3 sources. The first source of emissions is from buildings, including both electricity and natural gas. The source for this data is Puget Sound Energy. Next is transportation emissions, which come from burning fossil fuels for vehicles. We measure this with vehicle miles traveled, called VMT, which we receive from Puget Sound Regional Council. The last source of emissions is waste. We receive this data on tons of waste generated and diverted from the landfill from our waste hauler Recology. Emissions from waste are actually negative, so not shown in the inventory, and I'll get into the reasons for that a bit later. As this is our 3rd inventory in 10 years, there have been updates to models and changes to methodologies that sometimes change the data, but can also improve the accuracy of emissions. So we've redone our 3 years of emissions in order to accommodate for that. So one example of this is shown in the maps from Puget Sound Regional Council's travel models. The top picture is PSRC's model from 2007, which shows fewer travel zones in our city's boundary. The second picture shows the model in 2017, which better matches our jurisdictional boundaries. Thus, you can assume the emissions from transportation were most likely underrepresented in the early model, but more accurate now to our jurisdictional boundaries. Here are our community-wide GHG emissions over the 3 inventory years. Total greenhouse gas emissions increased 5% from 2007 to 2017. Our total emissions decreased from 2007 to 2012 by about 7%, but then increased by 13% in 2017. You can also see the breakdown of emissions and how that has changed by sector. The green shows emissions from buildings, used to make up about 58% of total emissions, but increased to 62% in 2017. The blue shows emissions from transportation, which made up 42% in the past and is now 38%. So overall, emissions from buildings have increased about 13% from 2007 to 2017, while emissions from transportation have decreased 6%. But overall, we're not on track to meet our 25% reduction goal by 2020. Although total emissions are going up, per capita emissions are going down. The blue columns represent our per capita emissions, which have declined 30%, from 13.2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per person in 2007 to 9.5 in 2017. At the same time, you can see the green line that our population has increased by 45%, showing that we're doing a good job to reduce emissions per person despite a growing population. This chart shows a comparison of per capita emissions locally, nationally, and globally. As you can see, Issaquah is at 9.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per person, which is about the same as King County. And it's just slightly higher than Seattle, which has a carbon neutral utility with Seattle City Light. Our emissions are lower than Washington State and the US as a whole, but double the global average. Now we're going to look a little bit closer at building energy. In 2017, we received 72% of our energy as electricity, which is displayed on the left, and 28% was natural gas, which is displayed on the right. As you can see from the blue bars, both electricity and natural gas usage have been increasing over time. The green line shows the greenhouse gas emissions from the use of energy. As we saw on an earlier slide, overall emissions have increased from buildings by 13%, but you can see a slight dip in emissions from electricity in 2012. This is mainly thought to be a result of the fuel sources used in that particular year, as less coal was used. To illustrate this, we have the fuel mix of Puget Sound Energy over the 3 inventory years. Greenhouse gas emissions come from the use of fossil fuel-based sources, which include coal and natural gas, which are used to produce electricity. On the left, you can see that coal was about 37% of emissions in 2007 and 2017. However, it was only about 30% in 2012, the same year we saw the decrease in both our electricity and citywide emissions. Thus, the type of fuel used is important for understanding the emissions generated. Considering the data, you can see there are a couple options for how to decrease our emissions from buildings. The first is to reduce the total energy usage of electricity and natural gas. Examples for how to do this include stronger building energy codes for new construction and energy efficiency opportunities for existing buildings. The second way is to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel sources. This means reducing the use of fossil fuel-based fuel sources such as coal and natural gas and moving to more clean energy sources. I will talk about this a bit more later, but there's legislation in Washington state that will require 100% renewable electricity by 2045, which will help us reach our 2050 goals. However, the legislation is only for electricity, not natural gas, which represents 28% of our energy use in the city. Transportation emissions are measured in terms of vehicle miles traveled. The blue bars on this chart show total VMT, which has increased in each inventory year from 2007 to 2017. VMT increased by 29% over this time. The green line shows emissions from transportation, which have gone down over the same period by 6%. This is mostly due to improved fuel efficiency in vehicles over that time period. Similar to buildings, you can reduce emissions from transportation in two main ways. First, you can reduce the total amount of trips or vehicle miles traveled. If you have driven anywhere recently, you probably noticed that there's a lot less cars on the road. Although less cars is good, this is temporary and due to COVID-19 and not really us making progress on climate. If we are able to make permanent changes like increasing in teleworking, then this can have a lasting impact. For example, King County recently announced that their 800 employees in the Department of Natural Resources and Protection will be working from home permanently. The second way to reduce emissions is to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel source. For vehicles, this means increasing the fuel efficiency of the vehicle or switching to more efficient types of vehicles like electric vehicles. There are federal fuel efficiency standards which have helped increase the fuel efficiency of vehicles over time. However, recently, these standards have been rolled back, which could impact the trajectory of emissions in the future. Locally, promoting more efficient vehicles like electric cars and increasing charging infrastructure can help reduce emissions from transportation. Emissions from waste are measured by the emissions associated with landfilling, recycling, and composting our materials. Due to the benefits of recycling and composting, the emissions from waste management practices are negative in the city. This graph shows how emissions would vary whether we use recycling and composting management practices or not. The green bar shows what our emissions would be if we were landfilling all of our waste. The emissions would be positive and would add to our total greenhouse gas emissions. The blue bar shows that from these activities, our emissions are actually negative, so they're not included in our inventory. Total diversion from the landfill has greatly increased over the last 10 years through recycling and composting activities. One example in Issaquah for this is that in 2010, we adopted a food packaging ordinance that banned styrofoam and required all food service packaging to be recyclable and compostable, thus reducing the amount of materials going to the landfill. We'll discuss other examples when we talk more about local actions. So lastly, I wanted to share a different type of inventory that accounts for emissions based on the consumption of goods and services. On the last slide, we saw that emissions from waste in the city are negative. Well, that isn't really the entire story. The geographic-based inventory that Issaquah and most other cities used does not account for the emissions associated with the things that we consume. For example, it doesn't account for the emissions from energy used to grow food in California that then travels here to the grocery store for us to go and buy. It also doesn't account for the emissions from making and transporting the plastic tub that was made in China that I'm guilty of buying at the store to store my son's Legos. And it also doesn't account for the emissions from the Legos themselves. So you can see there's a lot of different things that are not taken into that accounting. King County has taken a step to account for these emissions in something called this consumption-based emissions inventory, which is shown on the screen here. This shows that nearly 40% of emissions come from the consumption of food and goods such as clothing and electronics. This type of inventory opens up a whole new suite of options for reducing emissions that may not necessarily be factored into the GHG inventory we talked about today. It makes the case for additional programs and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as focusing on food waste reduction and promoting reuse of items and repair cafes for clothing and small household appliances. Thus, one of our breakout groups for next week is on waste consumption and can focus on this type of emission reduction strategies then. So I just want to pause here for a couple minutes and see if there's any questions specific to the inventory before I move into the local and regional actions. So again, if you have a question, you can just type question into the comment box. And Stephen Padua, who is the Senior Transportation Planner here in the city, is going to help facilitate that. So Stephen, do we have any questions?
Hi, Megan. We have a question from Nina.
Great.
Nina, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. I just thought I'd start this process. We got to ask questions. I had a question come up in my mind when you talked about per capita emissions going down 30% when our population went up. Is this an absolute population increase, or did that include annexations?
That included annexations as well. Yeah, so anything that changed within the jurisdictional boundaries.
I currently don't see any other questions in the chat window. Nina, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I didn't. Thanks for that, Megan.
Okay. All right, well, we can move on to talk a little bit more about local actions. And then if you have questions throughout, you can type that in, and then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So now that we understand a bit more about the sources of emissions in Issaquah, I'm going to talk about some of the things the city has done related to climate change. Although not all of these are direct climate actions, some are projects that have co-benefits to reduce carbon emissions. Others are more about carbon sequestration, which is the storage of carbon, such as in trees, and a couple relate to climate resiliency, or preparing for the impacts of climate. The actions are separated into 4 categories, the same that we'll be using for the breakout sessions next week. So I'll start here with energy and green building. So we remember from the inventory that buildings make up about 68% of overall emissions in the city. So this is a really important topic for action. The city has helped lead the way in demonstrating highly efficient building practices with 2 demonstration projects. Z-Home was the nation's first zero net energy multifamily townhome project. It is pictured at the bottom of the slide. It has 10 units that provide a comfortable, healthy, and highly efficient home for Issaquah residents. And a recent post-occupancy study, actually done by Leah Missick on the call today, shows that Z-Home is actually producing slightly more energy than is used on the site. Fire Station 72 is a certified LEED Platinum building and is another example of a highly efficient and well-functioning green building in the city. Green Direct is a program through Puget Sound Energy where the city will be procuring renewable energy for 95% of its electricity usage for government operations. This energy will be coming from 2 sources, a wind farm and a solar farm, both located in Washington. In 2017, the city hosted a Solarize campaign, which the mayor mentioned in her opening remarks. So this was to help bring solar energy to homes in Issaquah. The campaign brought together neighbors to save time and money through the group purchase of solar systems. This program brought 142 kilowatts of solar to the city and helped educate over 130 people on the benefits and process for going solar. As a result of the city's work and our community's dedication to the environment, we have nearly 150 installations in the city producing 1 megawatt of solar. We also achieved SolSmart Gold designation, which recognizes our efforts to make it faster, easier, and more affordable for residents to install solar energy. As a part of this, residents do not even need a building permit to install a standard solar energy system on their home. The Green Power Challenge is another Puget Sound energy program the city participated in that encourages residents to buy renewable energy. Last year, the city completed a streetlight retrofit program and switched to all LED streetlights. This will save the city about $45,000 a year in utility and operating maintenance costs. I think someone might be off of mute. There we go. The emissions saved is equivalent to 89 acres of trees planted, or 1.2 million miles not driven per year in the average car. And lastly, the city has a sustainable building action strategy that has helped guide our work on green building, including providing technical assistance to some projects in the city. So moving on to transportation and land use. Remembering from the GHG inventory, transportation makes up 38% of emissions in the city. The city has several transportation demand management programs, both for city employees like Orca cards to promote transit and van pools, as well as programs for residents, including incentive programs to encourage people to use alternative modes of transportation. Transit-oriented development, or TOD, is the development of residential and usually mixed-use buildings that are compact and walkable to transit. The city is facilitating a TOD project next to the SR 900 Transit Center. The mixed-use project will include approximately 325 apartments, of which 175 will be affordable, and they will also be incorporating several green and sustainable elements into the project. EV charging stations make it easier for people to own electric vehicles. The city owns 2 charging stations and has started talking about electric vehicle policies for new construction in the city as well. Complete Streets is a policy that commits the city to provide more safe and affordable transportation options, such as walking, biking, and transit. And Stephen Padu is in the process of developing a mobility master plan that includes this policy and more. Last, the Central Issaquah Plan was adopted in 2012 and focuses on creating a vibrant urban center while protecting our surrounding natural environment. As I mentioned earlier, consumption of materials makes up a large portion of GHG emissions when you look at emissions through a consumption-based lens. The city has done a lot of outreach and education on both waste reduction and increasing diversion or recycling and composting. The city has engaged with the Issaquah School District on these efforts, particularly through the Waste Free Wednesday campaigns. We've also done a lot of outreach in the multifamily and commercial sectors. So although the city has a high single-family rate diversion of about 62%, the overall diversion rate for the city is 38%. So that's why we target the multifamily and commercial sectors for more of that outreach work. The city has implemented a few laws to reduce waste, including the food service packaging ordinance that I mentioned earlier, as well as a ban on plastic bags in the city. Food to Good to Waste is a residential outreach program that we implemented at farmers markets and local grocery stores to help residents reduce the amount of food going to waste. Because when we throw away food, we're also wasting all the water, energy, and other resources that's used to produce, package, and transport the food to our plates. Lastly, we work closely with our solid waste hauler Recology on several of these outreach initiatives. Recology is also committed to making Issaquah's services carbon neutral. They have transitioned from fossil-based CNG to renewable natural gas and use carbon offsets for their operations. As a result, Issaquah's solid waste and recycling services are nearly carbon neutral. Now looking at sequestration, over 20% of the city is preserved natural and open space, and a recent tree canopy assessment estimates that 51% of the city is covered by tree canopy, which is significantly more than many of the neighboring jurisdictions. Trees have many environmental benefits, including cooling, wildlife habitat, clean air, stormwater management, and also carbon sequestration, which is an important tool for addressing climate change. The city is also planting 10,000 new trees just this year and is working with city forest credits on selling these credits on the carbon market. Then local companies can buy the credits to offset their own emissions. The Green Issaquah Partnership is a collaborative effort between the City of Issaquah, Forterra, and community groups to have volunteers help to restore and maintain our forested parks and open spaces to make them more productive, which will help with carbon sequestration. And the city has also worked with community groups King County, and Trust for Public Lands to acquire and preserve 46 acres of forested open space on Cougar Mountain. Climate resiliency, or preparing for the impacts of climate, is, however, a bit of a gap in the city's portfolio of work. We are currently updating the city's storm and surface water master plan. And in that, the city will consider the impacts of climate, including increased flooding, in those planning efforts. There's also been some initial work with Eastside Fire and Rescue on Firewise programs to reduce the threat from wildfires. There are several pieces of state legislation and then also regional collaborations that will help Issaquah in reaching our climate targets. The first and one of the most monumental was the passage of the Clean Energy Transformation Act in 2019. This commits the state to transition to 100% clean electricity by 2045. The legislation also mandates that all coal-fired resources must be eliminated from utility portfolios by the end of 2025. Also part of the 2019 legislative session was the Clean Buildings Act. This legislation targets the state's existing building stock, especially large commercial buildings, by requiring them to meet energy performance standards. This is for buildings over 50,000 square feet, so it includes some of Issaquah's largest buildings, but not the majority, which are more medium and smaller sized buildings. It also does not apply to multifamily buildings. There was, however, a strengthening of commercial and residential energy codes in the last cycle at the state level, as well as an increase in national energy codes, which will help reduce emissions from new construction. Another piece of legislation that would be helpful in reducing emissions, but that did not pass, is the Clean Fuel Standard. A clean fuel standard requires a gradual transition from conventional fuels, such as gasoline and diesel, to cleaner transportation fuels, such as electricity and biofuels. This is something I would expect to come up in future sessions, though, as well. Next, we have a few examples of strong collaborative efforts. As we know, climate does not follow jurisdictional boundaries, so the more we're able to collaborate, the further our efforts will go to reducing emissions. So first here is the King County Cities Climate Collaboration, or K4C. The K4C is a partnership of local governments taking action to improve our community's health and resiliency in the face of climate change. Issaquah was a founding member of the K4C, and as the mayor mentioned, has been very involved with it in the past several years. And just earlier this year, the City Council adopted the updated joint climate commitments in March of this year. K4C also helps work on partnership efforts such as the Green Direct program that I mentioned earlier. The K4C Climate Action Toolkit is an example of one of the collaborative efforts the K4C works on. Members of People for Climate Action, which we'll be hearing from later in the meeting, were very involved in getting this up and running. The toolkit is currently in development and is planned to be released later this year and ready for cities to use. Last, we have the Regional Code Collaboration, which the city is a member of, and it's a group working to develop green codes. There's some upcoming work on electric vehicle infrastructure policies, which the city will be involved with this group. So why are we doing all this? Why is it important to fight climate change? And why is it important to plan for the impacts of climate change? Well, the warming of our planet will have drastic effects on our health, our livelihoods, and our environment, both worldwide and here at home. And building on what the mayor was talking about earlier, is often our frontline communities that will experience the earliest and most acute impacts of climate change, much as we have seen these inequities arrive in the way coronavirus has impacted, especially communities of color across the country. These groups often have fewer resources to adapt to the changes in climate as well. So this slide shows some of the impacts we expect to see the most in the Northwest. First, we'll experience warmer temperatures, which will impact ecosystems, hydrology, and water resources. There will also be public health impacts from the increased heat, including heat and respiratory-related illnesses, disease, and stress. Again, those with fewer resources are less likely able to adapt to this type of weather. There's also an increase in threat to wildfires, and we're surrounded by a lot of beautiful trees here in this community, so that's another one to watch. As we saw in January and other recent years, heavy rains have led to major flood events in our city, and this is expected to increase with a changing climate. And last, reduced snowpack will impact our streams and our salmon with lower flows and an increase in temperatures in the summer and higher flows and flooding in the winters. So I just talked about a lot of the things in the city and region that we're doing to address climate change. We've also identified some gaps in our work. First, we're not meeting goals. This is not unique to Issaquah, but it is important to note, and one of the reasons we're getting together this week and next week to discuss a course of action. Next, I just talked about the impacts of climate, but we have done a lot less in the city on climate preparedness, including planning for and addressing the impacts on our community and natural resources. Instead, most of our efforts to date have been on climate mitigation or actions to reduce emissions. We also do not have a cohesive framework for prioritizing actions, for measuring progress, and adapting strategies to changes. And lastly, although we have community-wide targets and a community-wide inventory, we do not have that same information for our municipal operations. So again, this is why we're here today, with the purpose to get together to help identify recommendations for a course of action to address climate change in the city. The city cannot do this alone, and from what we saw today, emissions cross all sectors, including residential and commercial. This is why the recommendations that we develop in part 2 of this webinar series will be directed to the city and community leaders. So may it be businesses, nonprofits, or community members that get more involved. I know this was a lot of information, so I'm happy to go ahead and take some questions now or any comments about it before we move on to the inspiration and action part of our program. So again, I'll look to Stephen to see if anyone has any questions coming in.
There's a question from Ann Fletcher. Go ahead, Ann.
Hi, thank you, Megan. My question is about the circle of areas that may not be covered in the greenhouse gas emissions that King County did. And there were 2 areas in there. One was housing and one was transportation. And I wondered if those 2 areas is something different than what you talked about with the homes and buildings and transportation, and what that difference is, why they're included here and not under things that we're already measuring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I can try to speak to this. So with the transportation piece, for example, so that is more looking at the transportation that occur from transporting those goods, or it might be some of those same miles that we would be using to drive to the grocery store. That would be taken account in both of those types of emission inventories. But the miles for the food to get here from California would not be taken into account in the other one. So there is some crossover, but it just kind of shows a greater depth in the types of actions we can take to reduce overall emissions.
Right, and what about the homes and buildings?
That is similar in the sense that there is some crossover with both. But I don't think I could speak to exactly what that crossover is.
Okay, thank you.
And King County is actually working to do another update of this. And this is something that usually, counties or states might do rather than an individual city, because it is kind of pretty resource intensive to do. But also when you're looking at kind of the goods on a wider scale, it's more accurate to look at in that terms, in a larger sense, rather than just from a individual city sense.
Okay, so it can be very regional, or it can also be habits that people have, that the individuals have, that could be perhaps helped, corrected, or whatever. Yeah. Okay, great. Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Lee.
Lee, are you on mute?
Has there been any talk about restricting natural gas use in new construction?
Not specifically. It's been something that's been a conversation in the region. Bellingham has done some work on this. And it's definitely been talked about and looked at in other places. We haven't looked at this specifically in Issaquah, but definitely something that partners are thinking about and talking about.
I had one other question.
Okay, go ahead.
When you looked at the energy use or sources of energy, solar didn't even register on that. Is that true?
Yes, the solar is a smaller part of the portfolio. It does, I think it was, very, very small, either under 1% or 1%, but it is a growing resource. And Puget Sound Energy has been putting a lot of work into creating kind of those bigger solar farms that we'll be buying from to procure for our municipal electricity. And they're also looking at some programs to try to do more community solar types of programs. So looking at spaces where they can put solar on buildings that are already there and then have community members buy into that. So it's definitely something that they are working to expand, but the majority of the source come from elsewhere.
Okay, our next question is coming from Susan. Is the Solarize program or something like it going to be offered again?
We don't have plans to offer the Solarize program again. We do actually have someone on this call or the call next week who's from the company that we did with that, Northwest Electric and Solar. So we had a partnership with them where we had the community come in and vet a few different contractors, and that was the one that was selected. So there's definitely a lot of solar companies that are out there, and reaching out to them to get a price for your own home is definitely possible, but we don't plan on doing a full Solarize program again, but do keep some resources and information about it on the website.
And then the next question is from Larry F. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, thank you. My question is, did the LED streetlight retrofit include shading to reduce light pollution, especially near salmon habitats?
Great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, but I can look into that further. That was a project that we did with McKinstry did that, and we have a lot of information from that very large project. So I'll go ahead and do that and look into that, Larry.
Okay, thank you, Megan.
Mm-hmm.
Then our next question is from Connie. Go ahead, Connie.
So I like data. And when I was listening to your data presentation, I was wondering if we're going to have a conversation about whether we actually have the correct goals and the correct measurements. And I'll just go a little bit further by saying per capita numbers are more individually compelling than gross numbers, yet the per capita numbers did not seem to be very fine in your presentation. For example, you didn't seem to say if our per capita transportation emissions had gone down. It sounded like it was gross emissions. So I'm wondering if we're measuring the right things and if we're concluding that we have.
Great question. I think something that I meant to mention is that the city is also developing a new environment board, which I think several people on this call have been involved in those conversations. So we're working on that with council right now. And I think that would be a great place to have a conversation about that, looking at, are these the right goals? Do we need to be adding to them? What are the types of measurements that we're using? So we hope to use that board to be delving a little bit more into that. And with that, you're right, I didn't have the per capita emissions by those sectors, but I think that would be pretty interesting data to look at to see how that compares. So thank you for that.
Okay, we have a...
Wait, I just need to summarize that. So not a conversation for this board, not a conversation for this group.
I think also in this climate convening, so we'll get into next week, we'll have a lot more opportunity for more in-depth discussions. So I think that could come out of that discussion. So we'll want to be looking at an overall kind of next steps for how to address climate, and one of those might be to look at the goals and compare if they're the right ones that we want to be doing and working on. So thank you for that clarification. I think that could happen in the conversations next week.
Okay, we have a comment from Mayor Polly. Go ahead, Mayor.
Oh, thank you, David. I'm not sure if I heard you say this, and I just wanted, and maybe you did, Megan, but for those that are on the call, with the Solarize program, one of the community benefits was that a solar installation was done on the Friends of Youth office that they have on Front Street, and that was part of the incentive program. So did you mention that, Megan, or not? I can't remember.
I did not, so thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, it's very visible on Friends of Youth, and a great partnership that we were able to do from that. Yeah, and that was partially from Northwest Electric and Solar, and then also partially from funds from Puget Sound Energy.
Okay, next we have a question from one of the users cited. Where is coal used for energy?
So coal is one of the main sources that Puget Sound Energy uses. They have a fuel mix, and coal is one of them. And so that goes into the overall electricity bundle, and then we get our electricity through there. So it isn't specifically that, coal is used for one building and natural gas is used for another, but it's more the overall sources that make up the electricity usage. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not, so I'm happy to do a clarifying one if not.
There's no other questions in the chat window, but I wonder if there might be any callers who are calling in. If there are, could you just say your name really quick?
A political or position statement. I'm just making an observation. Okay, well, why do you have to respond to me like that?
I think we have someone off of mute right now. All right.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, now we are going to continue on, go in the right direction here. There we go. So we are going to have Drew Wilkinson from Microsoft talk to us a little bit about the goals that they have, and also the work that they've done to create a great internal sustainability group. So just give me 1 second, Drew, to pull up your presentation here.
In the meantime, everyone can hear and see me okay? I was having many WebEx issues prior to this.
Yes, we can. And can you see the presentation on the screen there?
I can. I think we're good to go. So
okay.
Cool. Yeah, so I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Drew Wilkinson. I work at Microsoft, and I am an aspiring Issaquah resident. I'm actually hoping to move out there in the not so distant future. And I'm here today to talk to you about Microsoft's sustainability commitments, specifically around carbon reduction and employee engagement strategies, which is kind of how I fit into this whole thing. So knowing that we're pretty short on time, we'll go through this fairly quickly. I do have some resources and links that I'll drop into the chat when I'm done. And it sounds like somebody is moderating the chat for questions. So I won't be looking at that, but if you have a question, go ahead and fire away. So I won't rehash what Megan said about why addressing climate change, especially reducing global GHGs, is so important. But to put a Microsoft twist on it, we can't accomplish our corporate mission of empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more if we don't have a livable planet. And Microsoft believes that those of us who can afford to do more and move faster should. And so, again, I'm not going to drain the slide. I think most of us on the call are aware of how serious and urgent of an issue this problem is. But I do want to give you kind of an interesting factoid. It takes up to 2,000 years for carbon emissions to dissipate out of the atmosphere, which means that the first carbon molecules that were sent skyward at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s are still going to be there for 17 more centuries. So just something to kind of wrap your human brain around. I think we struggle with this issue partially because we struggle with very long time horizons. Just something that I always found very shocking when I learned. Okay, so some carbon math background. Now, humanity's pumped more than 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide and other GHGs into the atmosphere in the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolutions. And unfortunately, we aren't slowing down. So right now, the world is adding more than 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. And a big part of the challenge is that as a society, a global society, we haven't really committed sufficiently to reducing emissions. And Microsoft has reached the conclusion that part of that problem is that people need a little bit more education and understanding around carbon math. And so these are the basic mathematical concepts that are important to understanding how this issue applies to us, whether as individuals or families, businesses, municipal governments. And one aspect of this that's relatively simple but important is accounting for global carbon emissions by classifying them into 3 categories or scopes. So as this chart illustrates, scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that your activities create. So for a corporation, these are things like to light up your buildings, the stuff that comes out of the tailpipes of your vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions that come from the production of the electricity or the heat that you use. So these are traditional energy sources. And scope 3 are the indirect emissions that come from all the other activities in which you're engaged. So for a business, these emissions can be super extensive and go all the way across your supply and value chain. So these include the materials in your buildings, the business travel of your employees, the life cycle of the products you make, and that even includes the electricity that customers may use to actually consume stuff. So for Microsoft, an Xbox, for example. And so what this makes clear is that we need to be able to measure all 3 of these scopes because you can't change what you can't measure. And go ahead and go to the next one, please. Cool. And so Microsoft, trying to just kind of put some numbers on this, in 2019, our carbon emissions accounted for about 16 million metric tons across all 3 scopes. And interesting to note, the vast majority of this, as I said, is all the way over there on the right in the scope 3 emissions. So the direct and indirect emissions that Microsoft is solely responsible for make up a fraction of the overall emissions that can contribute to the company. And I think this is probably true across everything that I described: individuals, families, businesses, governments. This is why the issue is so complicated. Scope 3 emissions are nebulous and spread out across your entire supply chain. They're really hard to measure, but that is where the bulk of carbon emissions come. And so Microsoft has been carbon neutral since 2012, actually. But in the last couple of years, our sustainability team has realized that this is an area where we're far better served by humility than pride. And we believe this is true not only for ourselves, but for all the businesses and organizations that we work with. And like most carbon neutral companies, Microsoft achieved this primarily by investing in offsets that avoid emissions instead of actually removing carbon that's already been emitted. And so we're shifting our focus as of January of this year. And if you can go to the next one. Oh, okay, it's different. What I was going to say is Microsoft has realized that neutral is not enough. And so we are shifting over to becoming a carbon negative company by 2030. And so that means that we're going to reduce our emissions across all 3 scopes by more than half in that time. By 2030, we've committed publicly to actually removing more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit as a company, currently 16 million metric tons. And by 2050, we're going to try to remove from the environment all of the carbon emissions Microsoft has emitted directly or indirectly since our founding in 1975. Next one. Great. So we recognize that progress is not just a bold goal. It actually requires a detailed plan. And so whenever we take on a new and complex issue like this, we strive first to learn and then define a principled approach to guide our efforts. And this has been fundamental to the work that we do around the protection of privacy, the ethical development of artificial intelligence, and it's the approach we're taking to pursue these aggressive carbon goals as well. So we've concluded that these 5 elements are incredibly vital to making sure that we can actually follow through on this. The first one is taking responsibility for our carbon footprint. I talked about that briefly on the previous few slides. We're taking responsibility for all of it across all scopes so that by 2030 we can cut them in half and remove more carbon than we emit each year. We're also investing heavily in carbon reduction and removal technology. So as part of our carbon negative announcement that we made in January, We've also deployed a $1 billion climate innovation fund that people can apply for grants through. And this is meant to accelerate the development of carbon reduction and removal technologies that will help us and the world become carbon negative. To be totally candid, we don't know how we're going to do this by 2030 because the technology doesn't yet exist at scale. And so that's part of why we're putting our resources into making sure that that happens soon enough that we can benefit from it, but not just us, everyone on the planet. And so that ties in neatly with the next point. We want to empower our customers around the world. We understand that if Microsoft figures out how to do this stuff, that's great, but the real value lies in helping other people figure that out and making it happen faster. Because even as large of a company as Microsoft is, we're still a drop in the bucket when it comes to global carbon emissions. So we need to be developing solutions that can help other people come along behind us and learn from what we've done so that they can replicate it and improve it. Along the way, we're going to make sure that we are providing transparency. So we publish already an annual environmental sustainability report through a nonprofit called CDP, and that is a very in-depth look at how we account for all of these scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and what we're doing to reduce them. We'll continue to do that and only make it better and more robust as time goes on. We're going to be using our voice on carbon-related public policy issues. So we're going to support new public policy initiatives that accelerate these goals, especially around carbon reduction and removal. And we're going to enlist our employees to help make all of this happen faster. And that's actually where I come in specifically. So we can go ahead and go to the next one. So I've been at Microsoft for about 4 years. I have not and still don't formally work in a sustainability role. But what I have done is help organize internally to create a robust and global employee community that's focused on that last issue of enlisting employees to figure out how Microsoft can engage its 140,000 person strong workforce from around the world to spur innovation, to find blind spots in what the company is doing, and to just generally help all of this happen faster. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. So our mission is pretty simple. We're trying to identify and act on areas where grassroots employee-driven engagement can be an effective mechanism for change in the sustainability space inside Microsoft and beyond. And our vision is to have a global community of informed, engaged, and inspired Microsoft employees collaboratively driving positive environmental change at every level of the company, from our supply chain to our operations, all the way out to end customers. Excellent. And our founding principle is pretty simple. We believe that everybody has the potential to do something meaningful. You don't have to have sustainability in your job title to drive change in this space. And that's certainly been true for me. You can see me up there in the upper right corner, along with my partner in crime, Holly Beal. This all started as just two regular employees asking a lot of really hard questions of the company around what we were doing around sustainability, and then asking the question of what can we do to help make it happen faster. And as we asked these questions and started learning, we realized that there were surely a lot of other people at Microsoft who cared about this and wanted to get involved, and they work in sustainability, but that didn't mean they didn't have a way to actually meaningfully contribute to that. So 2 years ago, we founded the Worldwide Sustainability Community. I'm happy to say we're over 3,000 members now. We have more than 20 chapters all over the world. I'll get into that in a little bit. But this is really the founding principle and what we're trying to do. Because what is a company if not just a collection of its employees? And if we can influence the way that our employees think and behave, we can make sure that this sustainable transformation of Microsoft happens a lot faster. Next, please. There's just a more succinct way to say it. We want to make sustainability part of everybody's job. Okay, so how do you do this? This has been a really, really interesting journey for the last 2 years. So for the vast majority of that, Holly and I did that as volunteers. This was not something that was part of our day jobs. This was not something that was asked of us of the company. It was an opportunity that we saw that if we could figure out how to take the resources of a $1 trillion technology company and all of the incredible brain power that these 140,000 employees have, what could we do with that? And so how do you get people who may not know much about sustainability or may not think about it in their day jobs or even in their everyday lives? How do you get them to engage? And so what I'm going to walk through on this slide, and this is where I'll spend most of the time, are kinds of the things that we figured out in the last 2 years with a heck of a lot of tinkering and exploration, and some of the stuff that I think is actually going to be applicable for any organization, whether it's a government or a private corporation. So no two organizations are exactly the same, right? And a lot of nuance is going to change how you implement these strategies, but these are the ones that have worked really, really well for us. So cultivate. There's a role for company leaders and employees to constantly be educating themselves on what their organization can do to be more sustainable. And so that first point, educate and inspire. All levels of a company or organization, you should be promoting curiosity and providing opportunities to learn. So this can come in the form of formal training, incentives, different resources. You really want to just create the kind of cultural environment that makes people want to understand these issues and how they fit into them. And then understanding the current state. You can't change what you can't measure. And so measuring against a baseline so that you can honestly assess where you are, what inputs you're evaluating to measure your progress, and then figuring out how to get where you want to go is really, really important. And for a workforce the size of Microsoft, we found that repetition is really important. Some studies show that it takes up to 7 times for something to sink in at work. And if people aren't tired of hearing you, you probably haven't said it enough. And I can say that in my pre-Microsoft climate activism, that's true as well. But in our experience, educating people on how their contributions factor into sustainability actually brings deeper meaning to their jobs. Not everyone is super passionate about what they work on every day, but most people appreciate understanding how their work connects to something bigger. So in this case, saving the planet from the climate crisis. And you can measure this in some ways through talent attraction, retainment, and employee satisfaction. Okay, nurture. So most organizations don't set out to be intentionally unsustainable. They make unsustainable decisions because they are complex systems where the consequences of one action might have an unintended outcome somewhere else in the system. And complex systems are really hard to manage because the web of connections and interactions and invisibilities that are inherent in them, they cross multiple scales. And the solutions that you need to fix them are going to have to do the same. And so in order to unleash the passion and innovation, a company's North Star should be making participation easy. If you meet people where they're at, if you challenge employees to prove what's possible and have company leaders back that up by creating the right incentive structure, you can change behavior. And both sides are benefited from a learn-it-all mentality and listening to each other along the way. So progress has to be measured against that baseline. And the more transparency that you can provide on the whole process, even if it's messy, because progress is rarely a straight line, the more likely that sustainable changes will take root and grow. And that brings us to the last one, grow. So sometimes the best idea that a team or a department in an organization needs to be more sustainable comes from outside of that group. And so you'd be amazed what's going to happen if you can just get people talking to each other across an organization who normally might not have a formal reason to do so. So in our case, providing employees the tools to connect easily and productively across those normal boundaries within organizations has had a tremendous impact, and it's unlocked virtuous cycles, it's boosted productivity, it's improved morale, and just created a general environment of optimism and positivity that is helping all of this become something that people actually want to engage in. And of course, the fastest way for something like this to grow is to scale through others and by empowering leaders in creative ways that play to their strengths. And always, you want to celebrate the wins when they happen because it proves what's possible when top down meets bottom up. I think that's my last one. I tried to do it in 10 minutes. How was that?
Great. Thank you very much, Drew. You did.
Sorry, that was really fast.
No worries. I think we'll go to Anne's presentation now with People for Climate Action. And then at the end, we might have time for 1 or 2 questions after that. So.
Okay, I will do my best to hang around. I still have some other stuff going on, but I'm in touch with the organizers. If there are questions that happen post-meeting offline, happy to do what I can to address them. And I'll drop some resources in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Cheers.
And Anne, we'll have you ready to go. Just a moment. There we go.
Great, thank you, Megan. I'm Ann Fletcher, and I'm happy to share with you a brief perspective from People for Climate Action which is a group of community members, regular residents, like all of you. Next. We were asked to answer the question, why is climate change important for our community members to address? More and more people are becoming aware of the 4 laws of ecology on this slide, as you can read for yourself. And the 5th law is nature always bats last. Next. Recent polls are showing a growing belief in climate science and a concern for preventive action. Next. A United Nations study says that we have about 10 years to turn it around. As Drew mentioned, time is crucial. And so a goal has been set for 50% carbon emission reduction by 2030. And as he says, carbon negative is even better. People are also coming to understand that our country is creating a greater proportion of the problem than many others in the world, and we have a responsibility to resolve it. We know it'll take great efforts to make a positive cultural and economic transition. So we work with government, as this quote so aptly puts it, to do things together that none of us could do alone, such as protect the environment. Next. So the People for Climate Action, PCA, was formed to help local governments to address this crucial issue, to implement comprehensive climate action plans to reach the greenhouse gas reduction targets set by King County City's Climate Collaboration, K4C, which has been mentioned earlier. So we work within that. Next. So why are cities so important? Well, according to Bloomberg in his book, Cities of Hope, they generate over 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And city leaders understand that fighting climate change will both protect people's well-being and at the same time spur economic growth. Next. Issaquah People for Climate Action started last summer with a community picnic in Confluence Park. And since then, with approximately 40 members, we have met with each city council member and city staff, city administrator, and mayor. We have made oral and written comments at city council meetings and participated in the K4C climate input sessions. We are currently supporting the establishment of a strong environmental board, which was brought up earlier, and working with the Office of Sustainability on these convenings, which we're excited will be recommending actions to the city and to the city council. Next. Our PCA coalition of cities has held 2 education summits and a webinar on energy and building. It has lobbied King County Council to fund a toolkit that all the cities can use, which was mentioned before. And it has developed also a detailed list of climate action priorities with cost benefit analysis in addition to support the toolkit and to support cities. Next. Now, some people feel discouraged about being able to solve these complex climate issues. And it does seem discouraging looking at some of the things that Drew shared earlier. However, PCA takes a positive approach, overcoming the red human barriers that we happen to have. They're natural on this slide, and overcoming those here with the green behavior changing strategies, which are on the left-hand side. For example, to overcome feelings of distance, use the power of social networks to make it personal. Social networks are working faster and faster these days to help change public opinion. To overcome doom, reframing climate messages from negative threats to positive actions and stories. To overcome dissonant and conflicting feelings, make it easier and more fun to choose the right habits, something that Drew mentioned. To overcome denial, provide personally meaningful measures to show progress. Measures are important, and that's something we'll definitely need to talk about. To relate to a person's identity, use the power of story, a story that speaks to them. Next. And there are success stories already. For one example, Portland, Oregon has integrated 171 climate-related actions to meet carbon reduction goals. As you will see, the carbon reduction goals are the purple line on the graph. At the same time, they were increasing in population like us and jobs, which are the blue and green line. So as you can see from this graph, the emissions started going down for them around the year 2000. And they have been working on this for a long time and can be a good.
It looks like Anne might be frozen for a moment. I believe she was just about done. She might be able to log off and then back on. But there was a song at the end that she wanted to share. So I will go ahead to that now and see then if she logs back in to finish those final remarks. But there was a song that she wanted to share here, although she might be back on this other computer.
Yeah, I'm on David's computer. My computer froze.
Okay, great. We're back
Can I
on
just finish? Can I finish up real quick?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I don't know where we ended. Did you hear the slide about Portland?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're just about done. So with a robust climate action plan, we can get on track for the K4C emission goals. As has been mentioned, we are not going to make the 2020 goal, but we still have a chance for the 2030 goal. Next. So let's get things in perspective. I'd like you to imagine the air as the Earth's skin. It is amazingly thin compared with the size of the planet. This air layer is far thinner than the skin of an apple compared with its diameter. Underneath it lies ocean and rock, and upon that rock lies a wee bit of soil and greenery. Yet inside this fluctuating layer of air, between a rock and a cold place, all life is protected and nourished. Something to give pause. And now, getting back to home, when we protect our bit of earth and air, the beautiful Issaquah Alps, we enhance the quality of life now and for the future. So sit back and experience the final reason to address climate change.
Deep forest rich with evergreens whose branches touch the sky. The oceans teem with living things both far and deep and wide. Whole jungles filled with creatures who slither, crawl, and run. Blue skies are rich with flying things soaring to the sun. And so many lands, from mountains to sands, are nature's own mother. We're sisters and brothers. Yes, this is our magical world. It's the place we call home. Forest rich with evergreens whose branches touch the sky. The oceans teem with living things both far and deep and wide. Whole jungles filled with creatures who slither, crawl, and run. Blue skies are rich with flying things soaring to the sun. And so many lands, from mountains to sands, are nature's our mother. We're sisters and brothers. Yes, this is our magical world. It's the place we call home.
All right. Well, I just want to provide a closing here. So again, thank you both to Anne and Drew for your inspiring stories. And sorry again, Anne, that the audio didn't work on that. We'll make sure to fix that. But really shows that individuals can make a difference, especially when they work together. And I copied a picture from Drew's presentation that I really enjoyed the quote on, that everyone has the potential to do something meaningful. You don't have to have sustainability in your job title to drive change. So I think that's really why we're all here together today, both representatives in the environmental community as well as individuals. So again, I want to thank all of our sponsor organizations again, as we have been meeting frequently over the past few months, and I really think this would not have been possible without all their hard work. I hope everyone has a better understanding of the local conditions on climate in Issaquah after today's presentation. Most of what we talked about today was specific to the city, but there are a lot of partner organizations that are working on their own climate initiatives, and we hope to hear more about them in the discussions next week. In part 2 of this convening, we will spend the majority of the time in 2 breakout sessions. The first will be an opportunity to talk about an overall approach for addressing climate change in Issaquah. We will talk about what the city, residents, and businesses should be doing to address climate change in Issaquah, how bold we should be, and discuss ways we can collaborate and work together to make progress. The second breakout will allow for more specific discussions around several of the topics we discussed today. A lot of people on the call work in some of the fields, so it'll be great to hear their ideas and make connections with others in the community who are also interested in the topic. The questions are on the agenda, so you'll have an opportunity to review and reflect on them before the discussions next week. Our goal at the end of this convening is to develop that list of higher level recommendations for the city and others to pursue to address climate. The city can make certain policies and develop programs, but we need participation from residents, businesses, and other community leaders to really make an impact. We are now going to do a poll so you can select your top 2 choices for the breakout group discussions next week. We would like to make the groups relatively even, so we appreciate you picking 2 options on this poll. And we have not done a lot of polls in WebEx yet, but we just want to take a moment for everyone to close the different windows that you may have open, including the participant window and the chat window. And then we'll be able to load the poll in a moment, and Gus will do that. So if everyone can just close if you have the chat window and the participant window open, then the poll will pop up after that. So I think Gus will just give it a minute and then we'll release that poll. Okay, I think we can put it up on the screen.
Just a second, Megan. I unfortunately need to close the testing poll that we had open, so it'll be just a moment.
Okay. No worries. It'll give everyone a minute to close those other windows. Something fun that we discovered in testing. Apparently the audio was not something that we discovered in testing, so we'll have that fixed for next time. And then while Gus is doing that, so I want to remind everyone that we have a recording of this session, and we'll be sending that and the meeting information for the July 30th webinar. There are a few people who couldn't join us today who will be joining us for that session as well, so they'll have an opportunity to review that. So again, if there's any kind of follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. And I see that Drew has put a few items in the chat box. which I shouldn't be looking at because it's supposed to be closed for that poll in just a moment.
Yeah, Megan, for some reason, it is not allowing me to load the poll since I've opened the meeting and I've opened the poll. So we might have to either post the questions in the question box, the chat box, and get individual responses because I am unable to load the poll at this time.
So, Gus, there is, this is Mary Lou, by the way. If you go into the 3 dots, it lets you go to the poll, and I can see your poll questions there.
Oh, yes. Yes, I think that's left over from the one that we were testing earlier. So if you're able to do that, so there's the buttons on the bottom of the screen, and there's the 3 dots that say more options. So as Mayor Polly was saying, if you go into that and see the polling button there, you can click on that and the poll should come up on the right.
It does, Megan, but it doesn't let you use it.
Yeah, I apologize, Mary Lou. We were testing and we realized that since you opened the poll the first time, it doesn't let you reopen it. So we'll have to find another way to do the poll.
Yeah, that's great. You could actually cut and paste that into the chat box and let people just enter their name and A, B, C, or D.
That's a great suggestion. Gus, are you copying that?
I'm unable to copy the poll, but maybe you can type that in.
Yeah, so well, I can just say too. So for the July 30th meeting, we'll be breaking up into the 4 groups. So you can just comment. A is the energy and green building group. B is transportation and land use. C is waste and consumption. And D is sequestration and resiliency. So if you can either type the name of it or the corresponding letter, and we will do our best to get everyone's options there. And if you have 2 options, that would be great, just so we're able to make that a little bit more even for the groups. And I know that there's a few or several partners on here who may be in one particular field, so we'll make sure that those people will be in those groups. So I'll just say those options one more time, and that looks like most people are finding the way to chat in. So the first A is energy and green building. B is transportation and land use. C is waste and consumption. And D is sequestration and resiliency.
Thank you, Megan. I've opened the poll so we can have a reference point as well. So at least we can see what the options are.
Okay, great. And again, we really look forward to these groups next week when we'll be able to do a little bit more discussion. So today was a lot of information, but I think also some really inspiring words from both Drew and Anne about how you can make an impact in whatever way you are, and including with groups like People for Climate Action and the different sponsoring organizations. So again, thank you so much for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing you on July 30th for a robust discussion and engagement session, which we will conclude and develop those recommendations. So I will leave this open for a few more minutes for people to do their polling, but thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
And Megan, this is Mayor Polly. I just want to thank you and Gus for pulling this all together. These WebEx meetings can be difficult animals to master, and sometimes things don't go the way we want. Not the first poll that I hadn't seen happen. It's not the first music video that I hadn't seen. So we're experiencing nothing different than what all of us are trying to figure out across the region with all of our meetings. So I thought you guys did an excellent job. Really looking forward to the next session. And thank you everyone for being patient with us and still staying engaged, even though we can't all sit in the same room and talk about it. Great group. Thank you very much.
Thanks.